Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, subscribe to our channel. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. I worked the night shift at a small gas station in rural Alaska. It's the kind of place where you can see the northern lights flicker across the sky, but it's also a place where nothing stays quiet for long. The station sits isolated on a stretch of highway that doesn't get much traffic, especially in the winter months. On the best nights, I get one or two customers, and on the worst, I might spend the entire shift in total silence, listening to the wind howl outside. But that was before I found out about the rules. The manager, a grizzled old man named Hank, had always been a bit cryptic with his instructions. He never said much when I asked why he wasn't around to help during the night shifts. He would just hand me the keys, stare at me for a second too long, and mutter something about keeping the rules in mind. He'd never explain further. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another quirky small-town job, I figured. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just past midnight when the first thing happened. A car pulled into the station. Black, no license plates, headlights dimmed so they barely lit up the area. The vehicle stopped in front of the pump, and a man in a heavy coat stepped out. He had a weird, stiff way of walking, like he was trying not to disturb something, but the oddest thing was his eyes. Cold, distant, like they weren't looking at me at all. They were looking through me. I went out to offer assistance, but the guy waved me off with a grunt. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed he was in a hurry. But as I watched him fill up, I felt something shift in the air. Like the temperature dropped, the wind picked up, and the world outside the station grew a little more wrong. I was about to go back inside when I remembered one of the rules Hank told me when I started. Always lock the door when you're working the night shift. Never leave it open. It seemed harmless enough, but tonight it felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the man finished pumping the gas. He paid quickly, not even acknowledging the machine as it beeped. As he turned to leave, he looked at me. And that's when I noticed the first rule was only the beginning. Don't speak to the ones who pay in cash, Hank had warned me. Not unless you have to. I didn't understand it at the time. But now, seeing the man's cold, unblinking eyes staring back at me, I couldn't help but remember Hank's exact words. As the man walked back to his car, I stepped back into the station. The door slid shut with a mechanical thud. I locked it immediately. Then the second rule made itself known. Never turn off the lights after 2 a.m. Not until the sun comes up. I hadn't thought about it until the man's car drove off, leaving me alone again. The station was eerily quiet now, and the buzz of the fluorescent lights above made my skin crawl. The old building groaned under the weight of the night. But it wasn't until I sat down to look at the security monitors that I realized how strange it all felt. There were no other cars in sight, no movement in the snow. Yet, when I glanced at the corner of the monitor, I could have sworn I saw something. There. A shadow, too dark to be real, flickering on the edges of the frame. It wasn't from the street, and it wasn't something I could explain. I glanced up toward the ceiling where the light flickered. Then, it stopped. I took a deep breath. The third rule. Never ignore the lights flickering at exactly 3 a.m. If they do, turn them back on immediately. Don't wait. I didn't get it. The power had never gone out before, and I hadn't seen any indication of it. But the lights flickered again. This time, slowly, as if the power was struggling. Then, they went out completely. My heart pounded in my chest. I rushed to the switchboard, but before I could even touch the lever, I heard a scraping sound outside. A low, dragging noise, almost like something heavy being dragged across the concrete. I froze. There was no way anyone else could be out there. No car, no footprints in the snow. The door was locked. Yet, the scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I glanced at the clock. 3:05 a.m. I reached for the switch to turn the lights back on, but before I could, The scraping stopped. The door rattled. Voice, cold, thin, and distorted from somewhere just outside. "Let me in." I slammed my back against the counter, heart racing. I didn't move. I couldn't. I thought about Hank's final warning. Never open the door unless the sun rises. Not until the sun rises. But the voice was insistent, urgent. It came again. "Let me in." I stared at the door, knowing what I had to do. I had to wait. I had to follow the rules. But as I looked out the tiny window in the door, I saw him, the man from earlier, the one with the cold eyes, standing outside, staring directly at me, unmoving, and behind him, I swear I saw the shadow again, this time far too large to be a trick of the light. The rules were clear, the lights flickered, the door rattled. Now the real question was, could I wait until the sun came up? The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window where the man stood, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. But what? The world outside was silent, the kind of stillness that only exists when something unnatural is about to unfold. The scraping sound came again, only now it wasn't outside the door. It was inside the station. The walls seemed to hum with the weight of it, a soft, steady scraping, like something clawing its way through the walls. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew I had to follow the rules, but the fear gnawed at me, a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:25 a.m. now. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't return to normal. They flickered, then blinked completely out. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. The rules said to never ignore the flickering lights. I hesitated, unsure of what I was about to do. The man outside was still standing perfectly still, his gaze locked on me through the window, and the silence felt suffocating. I reached for the light switch again, but before my fingers even brushed the lever, the door rattled once more, stronger this time, as though something was trying to force its way inside. My heart pounded. I knew I couldn't open it, not until the sun came up. But the man outside, his cold eyes staring, didn't seem human anymore. His skin looked too pale, his face stretched unnaturally thin, and his breath wasn't visible, not even in the cold of the Alaskan night. Then, a voice, a low whisper, so quiet that I almost didn't hear it over the pounding of my heart. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside the station. I spun around. The aisles were empty, but there, standing in the far corner of the station, was the figure I had seen earlier. The man. His face was distorted, like something was twisting him from the inside out, pulling him into a form that was no longer recognizable. His eyes were the only thing that didn't change. They were still cold, empty, watching me. But now, they were in the wrong place. Too high up, too wide apart. The lights flickered once more, and then I heard an Allah, the scraping sound, louder now, as if something was inside the walls, trying to get out. I couldn't breathe. My fingers gripped the counter, nails digging into the worn surface as I fought the urge to scream. I remembered Hank's rules, his warnings, but what good were they now? The man's form seemed to shift and sway, like the shadows themselves were wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the station. He wasn't just outside anymore, he was here. "Let me in," the voice repeated, clearer this time, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a voice. It was a command. I'd feel the temperature drop, the air turning thick with something ancient. It wasn't the cold from outside. It was the kind of cold that presses in on you, fills your chest with a weight you can't shake. The lights flickered one last time, then died completely. Everything went black. Then came the silence. I don't know how long I stood there in the dark, trembling, waiting for something, anything to happen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I kept thinking back to the rules, the things Hank had said. Never open the door unless the sun rises. I kept repeating it to myself as though somehow it would keep me grounded, but the darkness around me felt alive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of everything that was supposed to be. And that's when I heard it again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a thud, a deep, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The floorboards creaked under the weight of it, and I felt the first stirrings of dread slide down my spine. It was getting closer. I had no choice. I had to open the door. The rules, Hank's rules, hadn't helped me so far. Nothing had stopped the feeling that something was trying to break through. Something waiting on the other side. The door. I had to open it. But as I took a step forward, I stopped. In the far corner of the room there was a shape, a shadow, darker than anything the night could cast. And it wasn't just standing there. It was moving. It was moving toward me. Let me in, it said again, and this time I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't the man anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling as I collided with the counter. The shape in the corner continued to approach, slowly, deliberately. And then the lights flickered back on. The man was gone. But something was standing in his place. The rules didn't make sense anymore. The door was still locked, the cold was still seeping into my bones, and I was left with only one thought. Could I survive until morning? The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't go out. They pulsed, flickering in a rhythmic pattern, like they were trying to say something, to communicate. I stared at the ceiling, my head spinning, trying to make sense of everything. But nothing made sense. The shape in the corner had disappeared. The station felt too quiet, too still. The thudding, the scraping, the whispers, everything had stopped. But that silence, that unnatural silence, was worse than anything. I stepped cautiously toward the door, fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. The rules swirled in my mind. Don't open the door. Never open the door until the sun rises. I couldn't be sure if it was the fear or the madness setting in, but I felt like the door had to be opened. It felt wrong to leave it closed. I gripped the handle tighter, turning it slowly, bracing for whatever was outside. When I cracked the door open, the cold air from the night poured in like a physical presence, wrapping around me. But there was nothing outside. The man, the creature, was gone. The only thing left was the emptiness. The frozen landscape stretching endlessly under a sky too dark, too oppressive. I closed the door quickly, but the thudding sound was back, louder this time. It came from beneath my feet. My pulse raced. The floorboards beneath me groaned under the pressure, as if something was moving underneath, pushing against them. The scraping sound returned too, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was from beneath the floor. Don't panic, I told myself. It's the wind, it's just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had to call Hank. Maybe he could explain it. Maybe he knew what was going on. I grabbed the phone, dialing his number without thinking, but the line went dead. No dial tone, no connection. The scraping grew louder, and then it stopped. Silence again. Absolute, suffocating silence. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I could barely breathe, could barely think. I turned back to the door, my hand reaching for the handle again, and this time, I didn't hesitate. The door swung open on its own. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man. Or what was left of him. He wasn't the same as before. His skin was stretched thin, translucent, like he was made of nothing more than smoke and shadows. His eyes were empty, just hollow sockets that stared into me. The skin around his mouth was peeled back, revealing a grin that was far too wide, far too unnatural. His voice rasped out in that same whisper, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. Let me in. And the air around me grew colder. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. The man, or whatever it was, stepped closer, and I felt the pull of it, like a force stronger than gravity itself was drawing me in. I could hear the scraping beneath the floor again, but this time, it wasn't just the floorboards. The sound was coming from everywhere, surrounding me. It was as if the whole station had become alive. And then I realized what was happening. The rules weren't just warnings. They were a kind of protection. Every flicker of light, every scraping sound, every command to stay inside, stay hidden. It was trying to keep something out. But I had opened the door. I had broken the one rule I was supposed to follow. And now it was too late. I stood frozen, staring into the hollow eyes of the thing that stood at the threshold of the door. The air was frigid, but it wasn't the usual cold that seeped through the walls of the station. No, this felt unnatural. A deep chill that froze the very marrow in my bones. It was as if the creature itself was the source of the cold, radiating an emptiness that spread through the room like poison. The thing's grin, wide and grotesque, didn't waver. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the doorway, as if waiting for me to do something. Or maybe it was waiting for me to do nothing. I wanted to run, to lock myself in the back room, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The station seemed to close in around me, as if the walls were breathing, pulsing with some malevolent energy. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like it was made of sandpaper, dry and tight. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, slowly reached for the door handle, pulling it closed. But before I could shut it all the way, the thing's voice filled the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. Don't you want to know why you're here? I froze again, the words sinking into my skin like cold iron. Something about them was wrong. The tone wasn't threatening. Not really. It was calm, almost soothing, like a lullaby from a stranger. But it still carried the weight of something darker, something more sinister underneath. The station groaned as the floorboards beneath me shifted, as though someone, was moving underneath. The scraping sound had returned, louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I wasn't even sure who I was trying to convince. The thing at the door? Myself? It didn't matter. Then why are you still here? The figure whispered back, its voice growing darker, more insistent. You've broken the rules. You've let it in. Now it will come for you. The door shuddered in its frame, and I heard a faint scratching on the other side, a scurrying sound that was much too fast for any animal. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The thing stepped inside without me inviting it, gliding into the room as if it didn't need to walk at all, its feet barely touching the ground. It didn't feel real, not like any human. There was something wrong about its form, the way it bent and shifted unnaturally, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world at all. I could see through it, see the shadows twisting inside its body, like smoke trapped in glass. And then, before I could even register what was happening, it spoke again, this time with a tone that was sharper, darker. Go to the back room. I'll wait. I could feel it, in my bones, in the air around me, the pressing weight of its words. The rules. They echoed in my mind like a warning bell, but they had already been shattered the moment I opened the door. I had no choice. The back room was where the keys to the emergency exit were. Maybe there was still a chance, maybe, but no, it was already too late. The station flickered once more, and when the lights returned, the thing was gone. Not out the door. No, it was right behind me. I could hear its breathing, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. I stumbled back toward the back room, my legs barely holding me up. The door was just ahead, but as my hand reached for the knob, the lights went out again. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of scraping. Right behind me. Not so fast, it hissed. I could feel its presence, like a thick fog that wrapped itself around me, suffocating and cold. My heart slammed against my chest as the scrape of something sharp against the floor echoed behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could hear it, feel it moving closer, the air growing even colder with every passing second. I reached for the back room door, my fingers numb from the icy grip of fear, but the knob wouldn't budge. It was stuck, as if something was pressing against the other side, holding it closed. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It was quieter, but it had a sense of urgency to it. It was closer now. Too close. I slammed my shoulder into the door, but it didn't give. The cold seeped through the wood, a chilling pressure that pushed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Panic surged within me. I had to get inside. I had to. Suddenly, the scraping sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, thick and heavy, suffocating. And then the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the cracks in the door. "Open it." I froze. I knew it wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. It was an order. I stepped back from the door, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to get away. But my legs felt like they were made of stone. I could feel the pressure building around me, like the air itself was closing in. "Please," I whispered to no one, or maybe to everything around me. "Please, just let me go." The voice on the other side of the door didn't answer. Instead, I heard a soft, faint scratching, like claws on the other side, just beneath the surface of the door. My mind raced. The emergency exit. I remembered the rules. The station had a set of strict, unspoken rules about this place. Rules I had ignored, but they weren't just for show. They were meant to keep things out, to keep things away. I remembered something about the doors. The doors couldn't be opened unless they were unlocked by someone who understood the true purpose of the station. It was a simple rule, but the consequences for breaking it were unforgiving. I reached down to the door frame, running my hand along the edges. My fingers brushed against something, a faint indentation, a mark hidden in the grain of the wood. My breath caught in my throat. The symbol. I had seen it before, carved into the walls in the back room. My pulse quickened. I didn't have much time. I shoved my hand against the mark, hoping, praying that something would happen. A click. The door creaked open, and a sudden rush of cold air slammed into me like a wave. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I stepped back, heart racing. And then I saw it. It wasn't just standing behind me anymore. It was inside. The thing moved slowly, deliberately, its form shifting like it was made of shadows and mist. The air around it seemed to warp, the temperature dropping even further. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, pinpricks of light in the vast black void. It took a step forward, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, as if the very foundation of the station was moving. "Now?" it whispered, its voice so close it sent a shiver through my entire body. "It's your turn." I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, like something was blocking it, holding it down. The world around me began to twist, the edges of reality blurring, and all I could see was that awful, hungry smile, stretching wider and wider. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no escaping it now. The air turned thick, suffocating as the thing in front of me crept forward. My breath hitched, the cold crawling into my lungs, freezing my very essence. My legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by fear, by something older and darker than anything I had ever known. It spoke again, this time its voice layered, like a dozen whispers pressed into my ears at once. You broke the rule. You opened the door. I could feel the weight of the words. They weren't just spoken. They were embedded into my skin, under my bones. The darkness around me seemed to expand, filling the space, making the walls of the gas station feel like they were closing in. The thing's form swayed and shifted like smoke. Its eyes, those eyes, bore into me, cold and unblinking. There was a kind of emptiness in them. Not the kind of emptiness you feel when you're alone, but the kind you experience when you realize that you're staring into the void and the void is staring back. I tried to step backward, but I couldn't. Something invisible, yet very real, held me in place. My pulse thundered in my ears as the thing took another step, its form blurring in and out of focus. You don't belong here, it hissed, a bitter laugh bubbling beneath its voice. Not anymore. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered, threatening to die. My eyes darted toward the shelves. The aisles? Empty. No one had come in. No customers. No one to help. And then I remembered something else. The note. The one I found taped behind the counter when I first started working here, scrawled in uneven handwriting. Never let them in. The seal rot, the stampede added. Never let them in. I should have known then. I should have followed the rules. But I was desperate to know why. Why this place? Why me? What happened to the others? The thing moved again, its body like liquid shadows, stretching and pulling as it advanced toward me. Its voice deepened, growing louder. You don't get to ask questions. You don't get to understand. You were never supposed to know. And then it stopped, just inches from me. Its face, a twisted mass of shadows, hovered just before mine. The stench of decay filled the air, the smell of something long dead, like the rotting wood of an abandoned house. You're part of this now, it whispered, its voice rasping in my ears. And so is your soul. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, crushed by the weight of whatever it was now holding me in place. The world spun around me, darkness pressing in from all sides. And then it all went still. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath, harsh and shallow, echoing in the emptiness. The creature was gone, but I could still feel it. I could feel its presence in the air, lingering, suffocating, like the aftertaste of something rotten. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed in the silence. But when the door to the back room creaked open, I saw her. The woman who had come in hours earlier. The one who had smiled at me. Her eyes were wide and empty, her mouth stretched in a smile so unnatural it made my skin crawl. And in her hand, she held the same note. "You're next," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. And I realized with a sickening certainty, this place, this gas station, it wasn't just a stop along the highway. It was a trap, a place that fed on the unwary, on those who broke the rules, on those who stepped into the darkness. And now, it was my turn. The woman stood there, her eyes hollow, her fingers gripping the note as if it were her lifeline. The cold crept deeper into my bones as I backed away, my pulse pounding in my throat. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting an eerie glow over her expressionless face. The clock on the wall, that wretched ticking, now sounded like the countdown to something far worse than just the end of my shift. I could feel it now, this oppressive weight, the sense of being watched, of being known by something beyond the veil of the physical world. My legs shook, but I couldn't move. She didn't speak, only watched, her smile stretching wider with every passing second, her eyes now gleaming with something like hunger. Why? The word slipped out of me, weak and breathless. Her smile faltered for a moment, her lips twitching as if deciding whether to speak. Then, in a voice as soft as the wind outside, she said, "Because you didn't listen." The door to the back room creaked again, and I knew then that I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it at first, just a shifting shadow, barely noticeable against the dim light, but it was there. The thing that had haunted the gas station for who knew how long. The thing that kept everyone away, kept the doors locked after dark. It had followed her, hadn't it? The woman's head tilted, her neck cracking loudly as if trying to decide whether to approach me or just watch me fall apart. Then, with a sudden movement, she took a step forward, and I saw the floor beneath her feet, the shadows that seemed to swallow the light as she walked. Each step felt wrong, too slow, too deliberate, like she was gliding across a surface she didn't belong to. "You're the new keeper now," she said, her voice growing fainter, almost lost to the air around us. "You'll see soon. You'll understand what happens to those who come after dark, to those who break the rules." I stumbled backward, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. Every inch I tried to move, I was drawn back toward the counter, towards the door. Later, the door. The back door. The one that was never supposed to open, the one that was always locked, always sealed tight. I heard it then, the rattling sound of the door handle. A subtle, slow twist, like something or someone was trying to get in. My breath caught in my throat, the world spinning around me, and in the reflection of the gas station's front window, I saw it. A pair of hands, pale and unnaturally long, trying to pry the door open from the other side. "Stop," I whispered, voice trembling. "Please, no." But it was too late. The door groaned, the hinges straining against the weight of whatever stood behind it. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the sound of an old building settling. This was something else, something much worse. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, like an Arctic chill had settled into the very core of my being. The shadow at the back door stretched, and with it, the gas station seemed to warp, the walls closing in as the space around me grew smaller, tighter. And then, the woman's voice, low and final, broke the silence. "You see, you opened the door. You broke the rule." The back door slammed open with a sickening crack, and the thing stepped through. Something dark, massive, and formless. The lights above flickered one last time before everything went black. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. And as the last of the light bled from the room, I realized the terrifying truth. The gas station wasn't just a place where people stopped for fuel, it was a threshold, a doorway. And now I was its keeper. The air around me grew thick with an unnatural presence, suffocating, as though the very walls of the gas station were closing in. I couldn't see anything. The darkness wrapped around me, making it hard to tell if I was even still standing. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped inside me, like it had been swallowed by the emptiness. Then came the sound, the slow, deliberate scraping of something against the floor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, each movement sending a jolt through my chest. The thing in the doorway hadn't moved, at least not in the way I expected. It was still there, but it wasn't alone anymore. Cortana was paranoid and drove all that fear. I could feel its presence, thick and heavy, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. But I couldn't. I was frozen, caught between the cold void and the oppressive weight of the unknown. The scraping noise continued, followed by a low guttural sound, a soft rasping breath. My heart slammed against my ribs, the only sound I could focus on. I reached out, fingers trembling as I tried to find the counter. anything solid to hold on to. "Please," I whispered to the dark. "Please, just let me go." But the only response was a quiet chuckle, distant yet right next to my ear, as though the thing was standing right behind me. It wasn't the woman anymore. No, this was something far worse, far older. It was the one who had been waiting behind that back door. The one that had only been a shadow before, but now it was here. In the flesh, or whatever it was that passed for flesh in the twisted world I had found myself in. The scraping grew louder, and then, with a sudden sharp sound, the air seemed to pulse. The shadow before me twisted and coiled like smoke, slowly taking shape. First, a pair of eyes, black, endless, empty, and then a mouth, gaping wide, as if it were prepared to swallow everything whole. I felt my knees give out. My hands gripped the counter as I fell to the ground, and there it was, right in front of me. A face that shouldn't have been able to fit inside the narrow doorway, its grotesque features stretching and distorting as though reality itself was bending around it. And then it spoke. "You've come to keep the door closed," it rasped, its voice like 1,000 nails scratching against stone. "But there is no closing it now." I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. My body refused to obey me. "You will feed it now," it continued, its eyes boring into mine. "Like the others before you, the door is always hungry." In that moment I understood what it meant. The gas station, the strange rules, the warnings that had been passed down from every other worker who had ever stepped foot here. It was all real. There had always been something behind the back door, something waiting. But it wasn't just the gas station that was cursed. It was me now. I'd become part of the cycle. The thing behind the door, the thing that had been feeding off the others, was now feeding off me. The door could not be shut, and now I would never escape. And as the shadow reached forward, pulling me into its embrace, the last thought that crossed my mind was a question. Who would be next tomorrow? That wraps up tonight's pasta. If your lights flicker, don't blame the wiring until the next shadow creeps in. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It helps more than you know. And if you liked the story, don't forget to hit the like button. In the comments below, share your own horror experience. I'll be reading after midnight. Good night. See you again tomorrow.